That sounds great. Thanks for the introduction. Just a quick screen check. Can you guys see my screen?
They should. I can see it fine, so it should be good.
Perfect. All right. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, just to reiterate, what I'll talk about is this idea of robotic process automation. Microsoft doesn't use that term for the product. The product is UI flows, but it's something that's a relatively new entrant into the Power Automate toolbox. So we'll dive into that, what that means, how you can get started with it, all those good things. Before I do that, a really quick and very big shout out to the sponsors of this event. Pulling all these logistics together to make this happen in today's world, trying to do some new things is a huge challenge. Thank you to Tri-State Office 365, Soho Dragon, and Tech Platform attendees or those watching the recording. Be sure to reach out and give them a little bit of love. Go look at their websites, learn a little bit more about them. We need folks like this to continue to stay engaged so that we can continue to provide great content like this. Okay. So jumping into our content a little bit, this is kind of the big picture. And I don't know if this looks familiar to you at all, but you probably have people in your organization, maybe you're one of those people, who find themselves, in spite of all the great automation tools we have, keying and rekeying or copying and pasting. Maybe data starts in a variety of places like Excel, a legacy application. That key punch card is probably not happening anymore, I hope, but you get the idea. Or some other legacy app, or even a modern internally developed app sitting on a SQL backend or something like that. And it gets exported to Excel, and then maybe re-imported and moved down the line. And this little picture is an actual real case story. It was actually a restaurant chain that had to publish menus digitally in their restaurants, in print, that wound up getting kind of laminated and put out there in the restaurants, and on the website. And they had to keep all of those things somewhat in sync, but all of them had their own source systems and destination systems. So there was a tremendous amount of starting in Excel, then copying and pasting things into different systems, getting it out of sync, having to make updates and go through the whole process all over again. So the problem is real, right? The struggle is real. We all deal with it, and I'll share some more use cases in a minute. Here's a use case I'm going to use today that hopefully it might be somewhat familiar to some of you folks. As Microsoft 365 folks, you might be using Dynamics already, but even in the Dynamics world, we do a lot of work in the Dynamics and the Microsoft 365 space, and there's a lot of clients who have that last mile of integration, right? They've got things integrated with their CRM solution that brings accounting information into CRM and vice versa. But there's always those last few missing links. There's always that little bit that they've never quite gotten around to, or it's something new that got added that they haven't updated yet. And so there winds up being this kind of integration. You might have heard the term before, swivel chair integration, where someone says, well, you know, when sales closes out, the deal is done, the opportunity doesn't automatically go into the accounting system yet, and we want the accountability that sales can't go straight into accounting. So someone has to look at CRM and rekey stuff into the accounting system, as one recent case in point that we've worked with this. So can you do APIs? Can you do native database to database integration in those cases? Sure, absolutely. But the reality is sometimes a connector doesn't exist. Sometimes it's expensive to develop. Sometimes it's hard to get the bandwidth from the technical experts necessary to get that last little bit of integration done. And that's what robotic process automation is all about. It literally is like taking a user that would sit down at a computer and it will look at one application and it will grab data from that application, and then it can go key information into another application. And it can get much more sophisticated than that, using rules and all sorts of different things, scheduling to put the data in. But literally, if you sit and watch it happening, the computer is actually running. You can watch it entering information into an application, opening another application, and getting information off of it. And it's relatively easy to set up. It's the citizen developer thing again. I'm kind of a skeptic of that term, so I'll say that up front, but that's not what today is all about. So let's walk through a little a quick demo of what this looks like. So I'm going to kind of talk as this plays, but this is actually a real UI flow. It's really a couple of different things happening in UI flow that I set up for example purposes. Going back to the illustration I just gave you, we've got stuff in CRM, and it needs to find its way into an accounting system. So here we are in Dynamics 365. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this flow that's going to grab information and put it in the accounting system. So I go click flow, click run flow. I could have it triggered automatically. And here I am on the opportunity form. I'm going to grab some fields off of that opportunity form. Now, before I do that, because I've run the flow, I have to authenticate and log into it. Again, just like it's a computer sitting here and protecting data and privacy and all of those things. So I'm going to log in, and now it's going to actually open up that opportunity record now that the flow is running, and it's now looking at that form, grabbing information. It clicked the account link on there. It grabbed information off the account form too. Now it goes back to the opportunity record and says, wait, I need some information about the contact. It clicks the contact record, pulls up the contact form. It just scraped information off of the screen for the contact form too. Great, I've got all that information in my brain now, in my robotic brain. Now it's time to put it into our accounting application. I'm simulating that accounting application with Microsoft Excel right now. So it's opening up the accounting application, in this case, simulating it with Microsoft Excel. It feeds it the correct name of the file to open in there, and it now starts playing those keystrokes back. Literally, all the information you see appearing in here came directly out of Dynamics. Could have come from a lot of different places. In this case, it came from Dynamics, and it's keying it into this legacy accounting application. Maybe it's running on a green screen, maybe it's running with a SQL Server backend, maybe it's running as a web front end. Doesn't really matter. You can put the information in there. So it puts in the company information. In this case, it clicks a tab, it goes to the contact information, and it puts that information in. And you can see it kind of playing back. And when it's done with the contact information, it's going to enter the opportunity or the order information in here. Now, I did this as a very short demonstration in the interest of time, but you could go through line item information and recurse through line items off of an invoice or something like that if you chose to. So it's done. It's now taken all that information for me and it's put it into here without me having typed anything at all. It's reliably reproduced the keystrokes. It's not relying on me typing it in and not making typos. Exactly the information that was in CRM has now been rekeyed into the accounting application. The accounting application is now left open, and I can do more things with it if I choose to do those things. So that's our quick picture. Today's goal, what I like to do is I like doing things sort of giving you a push in the right direction, I guess is the way I'd say it. So you're not going to be a deep expert in UI flows, but you have everything you need to get started with them at the end of today's session. So my target audience is the business analyst who says, I may or may not ever do any of this work hands-on myself, but I need to understand what the tools are so that when I engage with my organization, I can start to develop requirements and have an idea of what the tools are to fulfill those requirements. And the other audience is a solution architect, the person who says, I am that person that might do the hands-on work. Maybe I'm actually a developer. Maybe I'm a citizen developer. Maybe I'm more of an administrator who's a power user and likes to get in and make these tools do their things. So we're going to have some specific takeaways today. I'll walk you through the whole process that I use to actually create what I just demonstrated to you. I'm also going to walk you through the gotchas, and I'm going to walk you through at the end something I did in the demo that you actually should not do. It worked well for demo purposes, but it's not a best practice. And I'll teach you what that is, why that is, and how to deal with it. So a few definitions as we get started to dive in a little more detail. You're probably already familiar with the idea of BPA, business process automation. That's really at the heart of Power Automate. That's automating processes by connecting to the API. The API is basically the way one piece of technology talks to another piece of technology without a human being involved. One API can talk to another API to share information. Power Automate does that all the time. If you've done anything with Power Automate, whether it's adding an item to a SharePoint list or pulling something in from Excel or pushing something out to Dynamics, all of those things are API access, computer-to-computer access, making things happen. Robotic process automation uses the same interface that the user uses, the keyboard and the mouse, to capture information from one application and to place information back into another application. So it literally works almost the same way a computer does. It just automates literally what a user is doing to get those things done. In Power Automate, there is a type of Power Automate, a type of flow called a UI flow. That is robotic process automation. There's a little more to it than that, but that gets you started with the definitions. So one thing as you think about these two things too is what's really going on in the world with these applications. If you think about business process automation on the left-hand side of the screen, you see that Microsoft is right there and kind of in the magic quadrant, right? They're right in that upper right corner of companies that are doing this, doing it well, getting recognized by groups like this is a Gartner assessment. If you think about robotic process automation, if you haven't heard of it before, it is a thing. It's been around actually for quite a long time, going back even before the days of Windows. It may not have been called that. But you see, not only is Microsoft not in the upper right quadrant, it's not even on the list yet. And that's because robotic process automation, as offered by Microsoft, is so new. Up to my knowledge, there hasn't even been an assessment of Microsoft as one of the players yet. I'm going to come back to this image near the end of the session and talk a little bit about what else Microsoft is doing to really beef up their RPA and take it to the next level. Now, I'm going to really date myself here. If you were around doing anything in the days of DOS, you might remember an application called SuperKey. And SuperKey was basically a robotic process automation tool. What you could do is you could say, start recording, and you'd start typing a bunch of stuff and it would record the keystrokes, and then you'd say, stop recording. And then you could just call SuperKey and replay back those keystrokes anytime you wanted to. Robotic process automation is really just a really sophisticated way of doing that same thing. Now, more recently, if you've ever recorded a macro in Excel, same type of thing. Robotic process automation is really just macros with a lot of programming constructs around them to make them really flexible and to make them work across applications, not just within Microsoft Excel. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of how is that different from what you might already be doing in a tool like Power Automate. Now let's talk about how we built that one, how you can start building your own robotic process automation. I've been told, by the way, having done this session before, some people do follow along. So if you want to open up Power Automate and play around with it as we do it, feel free. Others say that one a little fast, it's hard for me to keep up. So whatever you prefer, feel free to do that. But basically, three things happen in the life cycle of a robotic process automation project. First of all, you're recording. Remember I said SuperKey, same kind of thing. You're actually going to be recording what a user is doing to begin the process. Then you're going to refine it. You're going to go look at what it's recorded, and you're going to say, well, I didn't need to do that, and I can change some of these things, and this I did wrong. Let me tweak that a little bit. And then you'll run it. You'll basically just run it back and say, okay, it's done. Now play it for me. I can schedule the playing. I can kick off the playing based on an event. I can play it on a dedicated machine that's not interrupting a user, or I can have it actually being played out directly in front of a user when it gets kicked off, like the one I demonstrated to you. So those are the three steps. Let's walk through the three. The very first step is record. So remember, all you're going to do when you record, you're just going to say, I'm going to start the recording process, and then I'm going to do what I normally would do. When I do that, I might need to take a few extra steps to point out to the computer what I'm doing. So let's take a look at how that works. Very first thing you do, go into Power Automate like you already would to create any kind of new flow. You're going to go to the My Flows area of Power Automate, number 2 on the slide. Number 3, you're going to go to the far right and you're going to click on the UI Flows tab. So it's a certain type of flow called a UI flow. And then you'll create a new UI flow. Click the new button. Now, the first time, or really any time you click the new button, you're going to be asked what kind of flow you want to create, what kind of UI flow you want to create. And that is, are you automating a desktop app, something that's running on a desktop on a piece of software installed on your machine, or are you going to be automating a web app, something you open up Edge or Chrome or something like that to run? So you'll need to pick the right one depending on what you're doing. Now, your first question may be, well, wait a minute, Geoff, what you demoed to us, I saw Excel, the desktop app, and I saw Dynamics, the web app. So which one of these do I choose? You're actually going to do both. So we're going to start with the app we're recording from. That's a web app, and we're going to end with the app we're playing back to. That's a web app. We're playing back to a desktop app. That's Excel. So that's what we're going to do. So you just think about, where am I starting? Where am I ending? And you can go back and forth with these. I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, when you do that, the first thing you need to do is you're going to have to do some software installation, whichever one of these options you choose. So when you very first do a desktop app, it's going to ask you to install the UI Flow browser extension. So basically, that's just something that installs in, again, Chrome, Edge, whatever you're using, so that it can interact with you, and also install some things on your desktop. Likewise, if you're going to do a web app, you're going to have to install what's called the Selenium IDE extension. You'll go through that process, you'll install that as well. That also integrates with your web browser. You only have to do this the first time you do it on any given machine. So once you've gone through this install process, you won't be prompted for it anymore. And you may have to do some browser restarts and even machine restarts to get all this up and running and working before it goes in. And again, if you look at any given browser, you'll actually see the icons installed at the top of the browser. It allows you to interact with it and lets you know that it's actively running on your machine. Okay, so again, we're going to start with the web app because we're starting with Dynamics. That's a web app that we're going to pull information from. So we've clicked, we're doing a web app, we've done the installation, and now all we have to do is say, give me a flow name. What am I going to name this? And what is your base URL? So you don't have to, that doesn't have to be the URL that you're always starting from, but when you're going to record your keystrokes, what is the URL you're going to start with when you record your keystrokes? When you play back, you can change it, but you need something to start with when starting. When you've entered those things, you click the Launch Recorder button at the bottom, and you're going to begin recording keystrokes. So when you launch the recorder, this is what you see. Now, if you're a developer, you might go, this looks interesting. It's called the Selenium IDE. That means it's an interactive developer environment. If you're a non-developer, you might go, what is this? It looks kind of scary. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot you can do with this, but you don't have to know about everything to do recordings and automation. So don't get overwhelmed. The simple thing you're going to start with is once this pops up, in that upper corner there where the 1 is pointing to, there's a little round button that says REC, record. When you're ready to start recording your keystrokes, just click that button and it'll get started. It'll start recording everything that you do. So in this case, I said, okay, well, I already gave it my starting URL. Remember, that's this opportunity record in CRM. So this is open already because that's my starting URL. What's the first thing I want to do? Well, I want to navigate to that account, click on account, so that I can actually get information from that form. I want to read information off of that form. So I click that. Now CRM is going to navigate to that record, but you can see back over there in the Selenium IDE, I actually have already recorded some things. Okay, you've clicked some things. It looks like your window size is getting updated based on a new window that opened. And here's another click that you did. So I did an open window and click. So now I can click the pause or record button to go do some more editing in the Selenium IDE. My point here is, as I'm doing anything on the screen, that list of commands in Selenium keeps filling up. The more I do, the more it fills up. Now, once I get a few examples in there, I don't necessarily have to do all of that manually by recording. I can do it interactively. Here's how. So now I've navigated to the account record, the account form in CRM, and I say, okay, I want to actually insert a new command here. So I click down on the last command, I click insert a new command. And I'm going to set that command to store a value. What that means is, hey, Selenium IDE, or UI Flow, if you will, I want you to store a value that you're grabbing off the screen for me. Okay, great. And it says, okay, target value. Where on the screen is that value? Well, I'm actually going to go over to the screen and I'm going to click where it's going to get that value from. So it goes, got it. This is the part of the screen, number 5 over there, that has the information that you want. So in that target field, it fills that in for me based on what I just clicked on. Then I'm going to say, what am I going to name it? So I'm going to say, that's the opportunity topic. I'm getting that off the opportunity form in this case. So I'm going to name that field opportunity topic. Great. And then back up on the target, you can see it actually fills it up there, fills it out up there at the top for me. Now, one thing that's a little unusual here, remember, I'm getting an input right now from this, or rather I'm getting an output off the field. So if I'm getting something from the form, I just use variable name, right? Just a straight variable name in that value field. If I'm going to be sticking something onto the form, I actually need to use $ squiggly variable name squiggly. So you'll figure this out as you get into it. It's something that made me pull my hair out for a little while until I dug in a little more detail. I think if you're going to be doing most of the typical automation, these are the main things you have to worry about. There's hundreds of commands you can choose from in Selenium. If you just understand the store value command and these inputs and outputs, you're going to know how to do about 80% of what you probably want to do when you get started. Okay, now back in the Selenium IDE, as I'm debugging this, as I'm going through and building it out, and you can see now I've gone through and stored a lot of values and grabbed my clicks and all of those kinds of things. I can then at some point hit the play button in the upper menu bar there, and it will literally play back all of those keystrokes to me, showing me the values that it's gathered throughout the process, so I can test it before I save it. So I hit play, I watch it play through, and if I realize, oops, I clicked on the wrong field, it's getting the wrong, whatever that is, I can go and I can kind of make my edits as I go through this until I have it playing back just the way I want it to play back. And when I'm done, go click the little disk icon. It won't be too much longer before people don't know what that even means anymore. And that will actually save it so I can go back into UI flow area. So at that point, it is now saved it. So I'm done grabbing information from Dynamics 365 CRM. Now what I want to do is I want to go create another UI flow, and I want to put that information into a desktop application. Back to UI flows, click new again, brand new UI flow. It's going to be a desktop flow, and I'm going to give it a name as well. So simple name, demo desktop, click next when I'm done. Now the next screen I get when I do that is it says, what information do you want to have available to this application to provide as inputs into it? So I essentially just go build out my list. I can come back and modify this later if I don't know everything. But if you remember some of the values that I created in the web when I was receiving information, I'm essentially creating all those same values here. Right now, these two UI flows don't know anything about each other. They're completely independent. So all this is saying is, what information do you want to pass me to help you with this flow? There does not have to be any information. I can just go to the next step, but I know I actually want information here. So I fill in all those fields. It even lets me put in example values as well. So I can play the sample data back as I do the automation to make sure it works before I later substitute the sample values with real production data. Okay, once I'm done with that, I click next. And this is kind of a familiar looking interface. This looks a little bit like a regular flow. You can see that the first step there was start your UI flow. And now I get this other step that says launch the recorder. So again, sort of like I did with the web, I hit launch recorder, I begin recording. Now, one difference with this is when I begin recording, I get this as the drop down from the top of my screen. So this is basically an interactive element that says, okay, look, I'm going to help you record whatever's going on your desktop now. I'm going to help you record. And it might be one application, it might be multiple applications, but I'm going to record what you're doing in it for you so you can play it back later. And I get a little bit of a help there as well. So I hit the record button and I begin recording. So in this case, I go and I open up Excel and I navigate to the file name and I type in the file name, and then I start going to where I want data to appear in here. So if this were my accounting application, I would open my accounting application, I go to the company name field, and then what I would do is I would go to that drop-down bar that I started recording from earlier, and I'd click use input. Remember all those inputs I created when I started this desktop flow? They're all available to me there now. So I click, I want company name. And then I click in the company name field and it plays back whatever I last selected into that field. Keep repeating that process to fill in all the fields. If I want to get data from a desktop app, I just go to get output from it. So if it were reversed and I was starting with the desktop application and I needed to scrape information from it and put it somewhere else, I would go to get output to do this. Or if it's one place that I'm doing desktop to desktop, I could do both things in one fell swoop. So that's it. That's how I kind of record and track all of my keystrokes and get the data in. And it tracks when I click those tabs and all of those things, and it puts it into a big, let's call it a script or a Power Automate for me. When I'm done, back to the drop down at the top of the screen, click the done button. And it's going to say, okay, everything is recorded. And now that's recorded, here's what it looks like back in Power Automate. Again, you're in a UI flow section of Power Automate, which is a little different, but it looks familiar. Every single thing I did, every single keystroke I made, or data that I pasted. And when I paste data, it's literally typing it. It's not copy paste. You can watch it typing it character by character. There it all is in there. When I'm done looking at that, I can click the next button. And if I want to click on any of those individual items, it actually tries to help me by capturing screenshots of where I was as I went through the process. So I can go through, you can see here's a couple of steps right here. It said you did a left mouse click here, and it looks like you were entering a file name. And you did insert text input here, and here's where you input the text in here. So that's where I actually went to enter the name of the file that I needed to open in Excel. Okay, so then I can review my outputs. Now remember, this is my desktop application. I have no outputs from it in this example. Had I grabbed outputs from that, I could look at them here and say, here's all the fields that I grabbed during that process. Let me validate that they're correct and I got the right values in them and all of those things. If I didn't, I can go back, I can edit my flow, my UI flow a little bit until I have it the way I want it. Once I have all my outputs the way I want them, I can click next. Again, in this case, I don't want any outputs because I'm really done after this one. So I just click next. And then I'm taken to my test screen. And it reminds me, hey, here's all the fields you created when you started this. Here's the demo values that you put into each one of those fields. I can change those if I want to, and I can click test now. Remember in Selenium, I could hit the play button and play back all of my keystrokes. In the desktop UI flow builder, I can click test now and it will open up applications and enter all of my keystrokes for me. So I can be certain that all of my automation steps are working the way I expect them to work before I try putting it into production. Now, a few recording gotchas. All that sounds great in theory, and in essence, that's what it did, but there's some lessons to learn as you go through the process. So overall, first of all, Selenium and desktop applications are two completely different applications. So that can be a little confusing at first. When you first look at it, you might think, oh, it's asking if I want to use the web version or the desktop version. No, that's not what it's asking. It's saying I have two different pieces of software here, and depending on what you're trying to do, you need to choose the right one. And each of them is quite a bit different from the other. Those steps that it was building in Selenium look completely different than the steps it builds out when you're doing a UI flow for a desktop application. So be ready for that. It can be a little overwhelming to a new user, not too tough if you're a good power user, but it's still going to be a bit of a learning curve. You can't copy or save as your desktop UI flows. Real frustrating because it can be difficult to edit them very well either. So if you think, I'm going to make some changes, let me save a copy of it first and make my changes. So if I mess something up, I can go back. Can't do that right now. You need to just work with the one you have, expect some trial and error as you work with it. There is a premium connector to actually run these in production. I'll talk about that at the end of the session a little bit. So just because you have a Power Automate accessibility does not necessarily mean you have everything that you need. So I would say in general, especially as you get started, it may not be for completely non-technical users, right? SuperKey, that was for an almost completely non-technical user. This, I wouldn't say it's for developers by any stretch, but I'd say it's that power user, it's that citizen developer, it's that solution architect, it's maybe that business analyst, somebody who's very comfortable getting in and figuring things out and making it work. The web recording overall, remember that's Selenium. So the recorder may not always capture the right click. That's not really a problem with the software. It's just that detailed web applications these days, like Dynamics, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So it's easy to click something and not realize I just clicked the border around this field instead of the field itself. So use the play button a lot, test and refine. It's not that bad. It's easy to fix, fortunately. Not too tough to use. Understanding Selenium, there's a lot there. Selenium is actually something that's it's sort of I don't understand it entirely myself. It's been around for many, many years. I believe it was actually developed almost as a web testing tool to test web applications, and it's matured and matured over the years. And Microsoft has simply integrated it with overall Power Automate. So it's not a Microsoft product per se, but it's so tightly knitted, it would be hard to know that unless you went and did the research around it. It's just different. It's not the same as everything else you're working with. When you're recording desktop applications, sometimes UX is a little bit difficult to navigate through. For example, if you think, okay, well, I'm going to go open an Excel file. Well, if you click Excel to open it, And then you're like, oh, there's the file. It's right on the top of my list of most recently used files. And you click it. Well, guess what's going to happen when you play your keystrokes back? It's going to open the most recently opened file, which may not be the file you want it to open. So you need to think a little differently how you go through the cadence of doing things to make sure that whatever you do, if it's repeated, it will work exactly as you expect it to work. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the first two steps. Let's talk about the final piece, because all we've really done now is we've recorded it, but how do I actually put this into production? How did that little video I showed you, what did I do to take all those steps and have them automatically all play back one after the other? So the interesting thing is to trigger a UI flow, you actually go and create a normal Power Automate. And what I mean by that is just like you create any normal Power Automate, you create it and you call your UI flow as an action within your Power Automate. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a Power Automate trigger, and we're going to call that first UI flow that I wrote, the one that grabs information from Dynamics web application. Then when we're done with that, back in that main Power Automate, we're going to call the UI flow that then enters the information into the desktop. Okay, so what I chose to do, and if you remember, I was in Dynamics, I was on an opportunity record, I clicked the flow menu button, and I could see the flow here. How did I see that flow? Well, because I created a flow in Power Automate where I said my environment, it's a common data store trigger, which I assume will become DataFlex soon. It's a common data store trigger, and I tell it which environment it is if I have multiple environments, and I tell it which entity it's for. Now, when I do that, it's smart enough to say when CRM opens, it checks to see, are there any that are structured to run against this entity? If so, I'll make that available to the user. So the user manually triggers this one. Then I say, what's my action? Well, my action is going to be a UI flow. You can see I type UI flow, I get my UI flows here, and I can either run a UI flow for the web or run a UI flow for the desktop. And you can see next to both of these, you're going to need a premium license to make that happen if you don't already have the right license for it. I can set them up and experiment with them and test them without that premium license. But as soon as I want to call them from a Power Automate flow, I now need that license. Now, the first time I do this, if I don't already have an on-premises data gateway installed on the machine I want to run these on, I'm going to need to install the on-premises data gateway. That can be varying degrees of tricky. Again, it's a one-time thing on the machine you're running them on. If you're doing these in an unattended mode, you're probably going to want to install this on maybe an Azure virtual machine or some other machine in your environment. So you might have to go through the install process a couple of different times, but only one time per machine. So once that's all set up, this is what it looks like. I've got my calling, my action, my trigger, and I've got my two actions I called from that trigger. Let's drill into those in a little more detail. You already know about this first one because I talked to you about that. Now let's look at this next one, run a UI flow for the web. So when I run that, I'm going to say, I'm going to give you the name of the UI flow I created. Get opportunity info is what I called it. What browser am I going to run it on? So I chose Google Chrome, but there's multiple ones you can choose. What's the run mode? I'm going to run this attended, which means literally when this gets kicked off, I will watch it run on my computer. And by the way, I better not touch my computer while it's running in attended mode because it's just going to keep moving merrily along as if nothing happened. So if it's typing information to Excel and I click over on OneNote, all of a sudden it's probably going to be typing that information into OneNote or throw an error when it can't find what it's looking for a tab. So attended means hands off, let it run until it's done. Unattended means as long as the machine is on and it can get in and validate, it can run. So you might have it run them overnight when you're not in the office or run on another machine for you automatically. Then I'm going to give it the URL that it's going to start from. Now remember when I created this Power Automate for the web, it said, what's your, I can't remember the name of it, the starting URL. So I gave it an actual hard-coded URL where I could start recording keystrokes. Well, now that I'm playing back, it says, tell me what URL you want to play back with, and I can put variables in there. I can put data slugs in there. So in this case, I said, okay, grab our whole CRM URL, except for the GUID, the unique ID of the opportunity. For that opportunity, I'm going to get the unique ID from the trigger event. This is the opportunity that it was executed on. So this is the URL that I want to pass in for it to run against. So now it's going to run in context of whatever opportunity I was on when I did this. Now my last step, okay, I've grabbed the information, I've run the web UI flow. Now I want to run the desktop UI flow and play that information back into it. So when I do this again, what's the name of the UI flow? How am I going to run it, attended or unattended? And then it says, hey, here's all the fields you set are inputs into this. Do you want to set new values for them? Almost all the time you would, of course. So all those values, I got those values from the run UI flow for the web step. All those values were generated automatically. Now I just plug and play them into here. And now when this one plays back, it's going to play those values it got from the web back into the Excel play that I did. Okay, so that's it. A lot of words to explain something that's not that complicated, but to expect some trial and error. Okay, now in the spirit of full disclosure, what did I do wrong with that, right? Let's say that that's an actual use case, and maybe that pretend Excel is a back-end accounting system that's not well integrated that I need to put stuff into. Why would I have done stuff differently? What would I have done differently here? So if you remember, for Dynamics, I created a web automation, a UI flow that used web, that used that thing called the Selenium IDE. In real life, I would never do that because Dynamics already has a Power Automate API connector to it. There's no reason to use a slower, less reliable approach, which is UI flows or robotic process automation, than API. APIs are much faster, much more efficient, protect security better, all those things. So in this case, I really should have said, no, I'm not going to do it that way. Maybe I'll still type it into the end application that way, but I'm just going to use a regular Power Automate to grab the data from Dynamics. So how does that conceptually look a little bit different? Here's what we walked through just a couple of minutes ago. We had a Power Automate trigger, it called a UI flow action, and called another UI flow action. But in reality, all I would do is have a Power Automate trigger that then calls, or built into that same Power Automate, that then does a regular Power Automate flow to capture data from that application because it has a connector to it already. And then it would finish by playing data back into that desktop application. What does that look like, practically speaking, or specifically speaking? So here was our last one that we just walked through, right? Here's how it worked the wrong way. Here's how it works the right way. Now, it looks like, well, maybe that's one more step in there. Well, maybe, but these are very simple steps to set up. So when a record is selected, I use the same trigger that I used before. And all I do is that when a record is selected, that's the opportunity. It's already passing me the opportunity information. If I want to have all those account fields available also, then I'm just going to have actions that say, okay, go into that environment, get me information about the account that the opportunity is related to, and get me information about the contact that that opportunity is related to. Now, all the information, not just what I grabbed, about the account, contact, and opportunity is available to me, and I can pass them through to my UI flow for the desktop. So I'm accomplishing essentially the same thing, but I'm not having it pop open a browser, navigate all around and copy data from that, save it in its memory, and then pop open an application and do it. All it does is says, as soon as you trigger this like that, I've kind of got all the data that I need. Now I'm going to follow the rest of the process to populate that accounting application for you. So some wrap up stuff as we think about this. Business process automation, remember, that's API-based automation. It's using the programming interface. An example would be if you use Microsoft Forms and you add the data into a CRM record or into a SharePoint list or something like that. You're using the API to access forms, you're using the API to access your SharePoint list, and you don't even touch UI flows at all. Robotic process automation, that's user interface-based automation. So our example there was moving data from CRM into an ERP application, which may be kind of a combination of both of those things. And that's actually one of the real powers that Microsoft brings. If you look at the RPA Marketplace, if you remember that chart I showed you, and I'm going to show you another view of it here in a second, most of those RPA providers do not have good BPA in their offering. When you use Power Automate with UI flows, you actually can bring together the best of business process automation and robotic process automation in one place, not using multiple different apps. Even if it feels like different apps as you build it, when you're running it, it's a much more seamless experience and you can bring both worlds together. So that's one of the real powers of having all this in one place. Again, RPA been around for a long time. It's a very mature marketplace. So going back to my mistake, the thing I did wrong, when should you and shouldn't you use RPA? So to me, this isn't necessarily an official best practice from anyone but me, but this is the last mile of automation, right? If you've got a better option, which is almost any other option for automation, you should probably take it, right? If you can do regular integration using an integration tool like Scribe or something like that to share data, that's going to be more flexible, more powerful, more efficient than this. If you've got Power Automate with a connector to something already, use that connector. But if Power Automate or no other option available really does exactly what you need, or maybe you can do part of it in Power Automate, but that one action you need to do, there's not an action in Power Automate for that yet. That starts to become a good target for RPA, for doing robotic process automation. So, and as you go around and work with users, or as a user, if you look around and say, a lot of time's being spent keying things into multiple systems. We've got to submit information on different forms. These are actually real targets that we've run into. So giving you very specific examples. We are a Microsoft partner, right? So we do lots of implementation projects and we white label under a lot of partners. So even if you've never worked with us, you may have worked with us because we work with a lot of other partners. A lot of partners white label under us. So we kind of have this whole pool of people we work with to get projects done. Well, when you're working on 3 different projects for 3 different partners and however many different end clients, you've got to track your time in all those different systems. And you have to track it in our system too. So for partners we're deeply embedded with, we've used RPA in some cases to say, look, we key the time into our system, but instead of making the consultant now have to now rekey their time into some other system, we're actually going to use RPA to, once that submission is done, to then take that time and move it into that partner system on a more automated basis. One of our clients is working with a government web portal where they essentially had to do certain kinds of reporting every time they entered any kind of government building. And it turned into hundreds, if not thousands, of records they had to submit every week. So it was daunting. It was a new government requirement and had to do with COVID and those kinds of things. They're able to use RPA to say, look, that information that we've got to key in, that's automatically already getting keyed into our back-end systems. Let's use RPA to automate that so that we don't have to rekey it in. Basically saved a couple of full-time jobs so that they could, they didn't need to hire folks that could actually just fully automate that. And then even things like if you are a Dynamics consultant and you have to do a new deployment and you might have to create a few hundred new customer user accounts all at once. Well, you've got to create the Microsoft 365 user, you've got to create the Dynamics user, you got to give the Microsoft user the right licenses, you got to give the Dynamics user the right security roles. Well, all of that has been set up in Excel, and RPA is then used to say, just go through the Excel, as long as you're logged in with the person with the right administrative permission, and all of those things can rapidly get pushed out automatically for you instead of someone sitting there slogging through creating each one of those records one at a time. So those are some practical examples. There's lots of other ones out there. So again, remember 3 main steps. It's record what you're doing, refine your recording a little bit, and then run it. And you can, part of refining it is kind of mini running it. You're playing it back to do your debugging to fix it, but then you actually run it in production. You just put it in production and let it go. And again, those can get called, I called mine via a user initiated trigger, but it can get called because a record got updated in some back-end system and it can automatically call RPA for you. Just remember, if it's running in attended mode, you're going to disrupt the user's flow of work unless they know what you're up to. So you probably want those to either run off hours or in unattended mode. And this 3-step process is really a part of what we always think of as good automation lifecycle in general. These are new ways that you can say, how can I listen to my users and listen to my business? What can we do to automate and make things work better? How can we understand how their processes work and make sure they play back well in a UI flow? And then how can we wrap all of that in a Power Automate to connect a process to our users so that things are getting done consistently? And how can we know our results? Because things are always going to change. In fact, one thing with robotic process automation that's true is you're going to need to watch a little more closely than others, because somebody's going to go into Dynamics 365 and they're going to move one of those fields off of that form. And all of a sudden it's going to break. Now, if you use a regular Power Automate, you won't have that problem. But other applications, you won't have that opportunity. So listen, understand, connect, and know. We call that being powered by luck. So as you think about how can I identify great opportunities for UI flows and how can I bring those to my internal users effectively, think about those 4 steps. We find that whenever you think about things that way, it really drives up your success ratio. So a last couple of things here, and we'll have a few minutes for some questions. So you remember I shared this magic quadrant with you earlier. Now, one thing I didn't point out in that magic quadrant is this provider, Softemotive. So Softemotive has something called Win Automate. And Microsoft actually bought Softemotive and thereby Win Automate just a few months ago. So if you already have the right license for Power Automate, and that's the attended license or unattended, but at least an attended license, you actually already have access to Win Automation via Softemotive. So this is yet another piece of robotic process automation technology that's now in Microsoft's toolkit and your toolkit. And you can see Softemotive was actually already on the list of people rated by Gartner. Now, what you can expect Microsoft to do over the coming months and years, I'm sure, is gradually build that more and more into the overall UI flows experience. But what I can tell you about that tool, it's really the subject for a whole separate session if we want to get into it. It is a very mature tool. It has been around for many, many years as a very rich set of features. So those desktop recordings that you have in UI flows right now, Softemotive explodes that and gives you way, way more than you could already do. And it's another tool, another place you can go to record those items. And you can trigger those within Power Automate. So you can use Power Automate to call Win automations, to call desktop UI flows, and to call web UI flows, to have a very rich set of tools to do full robotic process automation. Okay. Last couple things here, and I'll throw up a slide for feedback. If you like that luck principle that I shared with you, there's a book on Amazon. You can, of course, grab that. I got a couple of free things here for you, too. We've got a couple of great books on deploying Microsoft Teams, best practices, adoption, governance, those kinds of things. So if you're struggling with Teams at all, something I can make freely available to you, just ping me. And of course, love to hear from anybody, connect with anybody on anything you might have, be it a question or something that's a challenge or something you're looking for some help with. We are here to help out with those things. So I've left my contact information on this slide too, so that you'll still have it. I'll leave these up here while we open it up for questions, but do use your phone to look at these and take a picture so you can give me feedback. I'd love to get your feedback. I do these things all the time, just like most of your speakers do. And the feedback is super helpful, whether it's a pat on the back, that's always appreciated, or a constructive criticism about this was too fast, I wish you'd cover this, you went into too much detail on that, anything like that, very much appreciated. Thanks, you guys. Let's open it up to questions. We have a couple more minutes before our next session.
Thanks, Geoff. Well, you made my job easy. I have to put the slide up myself. You added to your presentation. I appreciate that. So
happy to help.
Great session. I'll kick this off. I haven't seen any questions come into Q&A yet. You'd mentioned about if you have haven't been used the tools in a while. Besides Power Automate, Power Apps, and if you have Power Apps, using that as preferred to RPA. If you're a citizen developer and our Power Apps scares you a little bit, right? Because you got to learn the syntax and learn some of that stuff. I was in that boat a few months ago. You know, and I don't have the time. Like, I'm in the business. I don't have time to learn Power Apps. It does take some time to spin up. Would it be okay for me to do RPA instead of going down the Power Apps route, or should I take the time to learn Power Apps before doing the RPA?
So great question. Let me clarify. Are you talking about learning Power Apps or learning Power Automate?
I'm sorry, Power Apps, right. Power Automate seems to be relatively intuitive from what I did with it months ago. But Power Apps, you know, trying to figure out how to filter. So basically, if you're pulling in different data connections, right, and filtering that, all that is fun stuff.
So great question. And I think it's put exactly the right way. The way I would say it is, if you're already fairly comfortable with Power Automate, you're going to be pretty comfortable with UI flows. It's not as, I'd say it's parts of it are a little more technical in some ways than Power Automate, but parts of it are less. I mean, it's really nice to be able to go in and instead of say, I got to think about, exactly what the flow is and add steps, I just record my keystrokes and it kind of builds it for me. That's kind of nice. Editing it, a little bit quirky. That can be a little bit intimidating. But if you're already working with Power Automate, I think you'll be fine with it. Power Apps, I think, is a level of complexity above that. Some might say it's a citizen developer platform, but it's daunting to learn Power Apps. There's a lot of little codey things in there that you won't encounter with regular Power Automate or UI flows as much. Great question.
Anyone else got any questions for us? Post them in the Q&A box. I remember when I was trying to learn my Power Apps, I had a project where I already had done the workflow diagram personally, and try to do that in Power Apps, and well, between Flow and my requirements documents for everything. Solid 2 weeks at 50 hours a week, trying to get the syntax right and using some YouTube videos. Sean, I forget Sean's last name.
Yeah.
He has some great videos out there. But yeah, it's definitely a citizen developer. I would say if you know some JavaScript and calls, I think it's a lot more helpful because you kind of understand what your needs are and how to do that. If you don't understand that, it's a bit tricky.
Yeah, it seems like you always get to that step where you have to drop down to do some little thing in code. And that little thing in code might cost you 6 hours of trying to find the one line or two, unless you do a lot of that type of work.
Yeah, trying to filter. Then I had to change my data connections to make sure everything was in alphabetical order.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was all good stuff.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun to learn. Keeps all of us busy. But just because I've got a toolbox doesn't mean I can build a deck. If I tried to build one, it probably wouldn't hold much weight.
Now, so UI Forms is different than Power Automate. I take it. Is that something newer, or is that the new refined version of Automate?
UI flows. It's
UI.
a part of Power Automate. So I don't want to go back on my slides because the survey stuff is still up there. But if you just go into regular Power Automate and you go to where you would create new flows, you'll see a bunch of tabs there. And the furthest tab over is UI flows. So you'll still have all the same Power Automate stuff you already had under that tab and create normal Power Automates, normal flows the way you always would. And UI flows is just a new category of Power Automate that they've added.
Okay, great.
And it's been there since late spring, I guess. I think it went into full production in March or April timeframe. Yeah, go out and experiment with it. It's great when you see this because I think people start thinking about recognizing things that are happening around them that lend themselves to that, and then go play with it a little bit and see if you can automate some of that.
Okay, will do.
Well, thank you everybody for having me today. Great event. Philly, hello Philly. Hope it goes well for everybody.
All right, thank you, Geoff. You have a great afternoon and enjoy the rest of your summer.
You do the same. Bye-bye.
Right, thanks, bye.